Civilization's first battles with disease were not fought with microscopes, vaccines, or hazmat suits, but with prayers, omens, and offerings to the gods. Long before humanity had the faintest idea of bacteria or viruses, ancient societies recorded the devastation of plagues in stone inscriptions, clay tablets, papyrus scrolls, and epic poems. These records are fragmentary, yet hauntingly vivid, like voices echoing from civilizations that believed they were being punished by divine wrath. To walk into the ancient world was to live in a landscape where the invisible could strike at any time, crippling armies, emptying palaces, and leaving behind ghost towns on the banks of rivers. One of the earliest glimpses comes from Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization. Archaeologists have uncovered tablets from the city of Mari, on the Euphrates, describing a pestilence so severe that livestock and humans perished together. Some translations speak of entire households vanishing within days. This plague of Mari, dating back to the 18th century BCE, may have been a viral hemorrhagic fever or something akin to anthrax. What mattered to those who lived through it was not the cause but the terror. Priests wrote urgent letters to the king describing temples filled with the dead, fields overrun by wild dogs because shepherds had collapsed, and oracles blaming the disaster on broken promises to the gods. Already we see a pattern that will recur for millennia: disease reshaping politics and belief. In this case, the king was forced to halt military campaigns because his army was too weakened to march, proving that microbes, though invisible, were often more decisive than swords. In ancient Egypt, pestilence seeped into religious memory and myth. Hieroglyphic inscriptions sometimes describe waves of sickness spreading, as the Nile spreads its waters, a metaphor both poetic and terrifying. Scholars have long debated whether the biblical plagues of Exodus, boils, pestilence among cattle, death of the firstborn, were dramatized memories of real Egyptian outbreaks. Whatever their precise form, Egyptians treated disease as an imbalance between the world of humans and the gods. Priests prescribed spells alongside herbal remedies, while ordinary families clung to amulets and charms. Mummies reveal evidence of smallpox-like pustules and tuberculosis lesions, proof that even pharaohs could not escape what the poor endured. Imagine the paradox of golden tombs filled with treasures, constructed by hands weakened by disease, standing as silent monuments to a civilization constantly haunted by unseen killers. The Greeks left some of the most chilling first-person accounts. During the Peloponnesian War in 430 BCE, Athens was struck by a plague that arrived through its port of Piraeus, likely carried by soldiers and traders. The historian Thucydides, himself a survivor, described symptoms in agonizing detail: sudden fevers, inflamed eyes, uncontrollable coughing, stomach pains, and in some cases, gangrene of the extremities. Victims often died on the 7th or 9th day, and the sheer scale of the outbreak overwhelmed Athenian society. Corpses were left unburied in the streets, funeral pyres burned non-stop, and social order dissolved as the sick abandoned the sick. Some scholars think this was typhus, others smallpox or measles, but the exact pathogen remains uncertain. What is certain is the historical consequence: Athens, weakened militarily and psychologically, lost its dominance in Greece. A war remembered as a clash of city-states was in truth decided by a microbe. Disease seeped into Greek philosophy as well. Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, wrote of epidemics in terms of airs, waters, and places, suggesting that environment shaped health. Although he did not understand germs, he pushed thought away from pure superstition and toward natural explanations. His works on epidemic diseases became reference texts for centuries, copied and recopied in monastic scriptoria. Behind these writings, however, lingered the lived horror of communities struck by outbreaks, villages where every second house lay empty, ports closed by fear, temples filled with supplicants begging Apollo or Asclepius for mercy. Farther east, ancient India and China recorded plagues that are little known in the West but equally transformative. Sanskrit medical texts such as the Charaka Samhita mention Masurika, a disease with pustular eruptions suggestive of smallpox. In China, bamboo annals and later dynastic histories mention strange pestilences that could depopulate whole provinces. Without microscopes, observers focused on the visible, the pattern of seasons, the alignment of stars, the color of rashes. Court astrologers might claim that eclipses predicted outbreaks, while Taoist healers prepared potions and incantations. These records matter because they remind us that plagues were never isolated events but global, striking wherever humans gathered in density. Even myths bear traces of epidemic trauma. In Homer's Iliad, the epic opens not with battle but with a plague. The Greek army offends the god Apollo, who responds by shooting arrows of pestilence into their camp, felling men and animals alike. Although mythological, this reflects an ancient recognition: armies in close quarters were uniquely vulnerable. War and plague moved together like twin horsemen of doom, one visible with swords and shields, the other invisible yet equally decisive. The image of Apollo's arrows captures how people of the time imagined disease, as a supernatural weapon, swift and merciless, impossible to block. For rulers, plagues posed existential threats not only to populations but to legitimacy. Kings were judged by their ability to keep the land fertile and the people safe. When pestilence struck, murmurs of divine displeasure could topple dynasties. In Mesopotamia, ritual scapegoats were sometimes sacrificed, their deaths symbolically absorbing the sickness. In Egypt, priests staged elaborate purification rites along the Nile. In Greece, cities sometimes expelled foreigners or accused marginalized groups of harboring curses. These responses, irrational by modern standards, reveal the deep fear plagues inspired, the sense that something uncanny and uncontrollable had infiltrated the human world. The archaeological record tells its own story. In ancient cemeteries, archaeologists find layers of burials crammed into a single year, mass graves suggesting sudden surges of death. At Tel Brak in Syria, human remains show trauma not from weapons but from abrupt mass mortality. In Egypt, certain mummies bear scarring consistent with smallpox. In Greek islands, pits filled with hasty burials match Thucydides' timeline of the Athenian plague. These findings confirm that the textual accounts were not exaggerations but desperate attempts to make sense of overwhelming calamity. What makes these earliest plagues so haunting is their dual invisibility. First, they were literally invisible, no one could see a bacterium or virus. Second, many of them have nearly vanished from collective memory, overshadowed by later, better documented catastrophes like the Black Death. Yet in their time, they were apocalyptic. The plague of Athens changed the trajectory of Greek civilization. The pestilence of Mari forced kings to halt wars. Egyptian outbreaks filtered into stories retold across centuries as biblical plagues. Each left fingerprints on history, but faint enough that most modern readers barely notice them. When we look back, these ancient afflictions remind us that disease is as old as civilization itself. The very act of building cities, storing grain, and trading across seas created the perfect environment for microbes to thrive. Our ancestors saw in these plagues the hand of gods or demons. We see in them the first chapters of an endless struggle between humanity and the microscopic world. And though the names of these forgotten plagues are often lost, their legacy endures in the ruins of cities, in the myths that shaped religions, and in the subtle turns of history that decided which empires rose and which crumbled. They were the first whispers of a story that would echo through every age to come. The Roman Empire was a marvel of engineering, law, and military discipline, but behind its marble facades and sprawling roads lurked enemies too small to see. Rome's downfall is often attributed to barbarian invasions, political corruption, or economic strain, but hidden in the shadows were the plagues that gnawed away at its foundations. Two epidemics, in particular, stand out as invisible enemies: the Antonine Plague of the 2nd century and the Plague of Cyprian in the 3rd. These were not simply medical events, they were historical earthquakes that shook the empire to its core, shifting the balance of power and sowing fear across its vast provinces. The Antonine Plague began in 165 CE, carried back to Rome by soldiers returning from campaigns in the east. Contemporary accounts suggest it was smallpox, though some argue it may have been measles. What is undeniable is the sheer scale of devastation. The physician Galen, whose writings would dominate medical thought for centuries, described fevers, diarrhea, and eruptions that covered the body with sores, leaving survivors scarred. The plague swept through the empire like a ghost army, killing an estimated 5 million people. In cities, funeral pyres burned day and night; in villages, entire families vanished. Rome's mighty legions, once the hammer of the world, were reduced to skeleton forces, unable to defend borders or enforce imperial will. For ordinary Romans, the experience was apocalyptic. Imagine bustling markets in Rome suddenly silenced, amphitheaters abandoned, streets filled not with the clamor of trade but with the wails of mourners. Coins were stamped less frequently, not just because of economic crisis but because mint workers themselves were dying. Inscriptions in distant provinces show a sudden drop in construction projects, even temples halted mid-build as laborers succumbed. The empire that prided itself on conquering the known world was now conquered by something invisible, something it could neither see nor understand. The Antonine Plague also struck the heart of leadership. Emperor Marcus Aurelius, remembered as the philosopher king who wrote the Meditations, spent much of his reign not in peaceful contemplation but wrestling with the endless tide of death. He personally witnessed the plague's grip on his legions as he fought along the Danube frontier. Some sources suggest he may have died of the plague himself in 180 CE. If true, the empire not only lost countless citizens but also a ruler whose stability and intellect had kept chaos at bay. His death marked the beginning of what historians call Rome's decline, and the Antonine Plague was one of its hidden catalysts. Less than a century later, Rome faced another microscopic adversary, the Plague of Cyprian, named after the Christian bishop who left behind a harrowing description. Beginning around 249 CE, it lasted for nearly 2 decades, flaring across provinces from Africa to the heart of Italy. Cyprian described horrifying symptoms: unrelenting diarrhea, vomiting, fever, blindness, hearing loss, and in some cases, people literally expelling parts of their intestines. One chilling line recounts how victims wasted away with the weakness of their bodies, even when strength of mind remained. To later readers, it sounded like a punishment from the gods, a bodily disintegration that mirrored the empire's unraveling. The scale was staggering. At its peak, reports claim 5,000 people died daily in Rome alone. Entire towns were depopulated, farmland went untilled, armies could not muster. The empire, already strained by political instability, faced a perfect storm: invasions on the borders, emperors rising and falling in quick succession, and an epidemic that hollowed out the population. The plague of Cyprian magnified every weakness, turning cracks into fissures. And yet, out of this devastation came cultural shifts that would echo for centuries. The plague struck pagans and Christians alike, but the Christian communities often fared better, not because of divine protection, but because of mutual aid. While traditional Roman religion saw plagues as curses to be endured or propitiated with sacrifices, Christians organized care for the sick, tended to the dying, and buried the dead with dignity. This contrast left a deep impression. Pagans, abandoned by frightened neighbors, sometimes converted to the faith of those who had shown compassion. In this way, disease indirectly accelerated the spread of Christianity across the empire, transforming Rome not only politically but spiritually. Both the Antonine and Cyprian plagues also revealed the limits of Roman medicine. Despite Galen's vast influence, treatments were little more than herbal concoctions, bloodletting, and prayers to healing gods like Asclepius. Lacking the concept of contagion, Romans often clustered together in temples during outbreaks, ironically increasing transmission. Their sewer systems, baths, and aqueducts, normally symbols of hygiene, could become conduits for disease when infrastructure decayed. What once gave Rome its edge as a clean, ordered society now sometimes turned against it, spreading sickness more efficiently than it contained it. The psychological toll was immense. Inscriptions from the time speak of despair, divine punishment, and the collapse of trust in traditional gods. Rumors spread that Christians, with their strange rituals, had angered the old deities, and persecutions flared. At the same time, apocalyptic sects gained followers, preaching that the world was ending and only faith could save humanity. For citizens who had grown up in an empire that seemed eternal, the sudden fragility of Rome must have been terrifying. The invincible legions, the golden palaces, the endless roads, all could not shield them from the unseen foe. Archaeological evidence supports the written accounts. Mass graves from this period suggest rushed burials, with bodies piled together rather than carefully interred. Coins show sudden changes in imagery, perhaps reflecting emperors' desperate attempts to project strength during crisis. In some regions, farmland was abandoned, leading to rewilding of landscapes once tightly controlled. These are the scars of plagues, written not in words but in the earth itself. When historians trace the decline of Rome, they point to military defeats, economic strain, or internal corruption. Yet woven through all these threads is the silent influence of plague. The Antonine Plague weakened the empire at its height, undercutting its manpower and morale. The plague of Cyprian struck again during a century of chaos, ensuring that Rome could never fully recover its former stability. These epidemics were like termites in a grand structure, invisible until the beams gave way. And perhaps most haunting of all is how forgotten these plagues became. Ask most people today about the fall of Rome, and they speak of Visigoths and Vandals, of emperors gone mad. Few remember the sickness that killed millions, reshaped faith, and hollowed out the empire from within. The plagues of Rome are reminders that history is never just about battles and crowns, but about breath and blood, about fragile bodies facing forces beyond comprehension. Rome was not only conquered by barbarians, it was conquered by disease. In the middle of the 6th century, the Roman dream of unity flickered once more under the rule of Emperor Justinian. His ambition was nothing less than to restore the grandeur of the old empire, reuniting East and West under Constantinople's glittering domes. He commanded armies that marched across North Africa and Italy, he raised magnificent monuments like the Hagia Sophia, and he envisioned himself as the new Augustus. Yet at the very height of this imperial revival, an invisible tide swept in that would drown his ambitions. It began quietly, with whispers of sickness in distant ports. Then, like a shadow spreading across maps, the first great bubonic plague in recorded history surged through the empire. It would claim millions, destabilize the Mediterranean world, and haunt humanity for centuries to come. The Plague of Justinian, as it came to be known, erupted around 541 CE. Its origins lay in the trade routes that connected the empire to Africa and Asia. Ships laden with grain from Egypt carried more than food, hidden among the sacks were fleas, and on those fleas, a deadly bacterium we now call Yersinia pestis. This microscopic stowaway had already made its way through rodents and animals, and now it slipped aboard human ships, ready to spread through Constantinople, the empire's beating heart. The city, with its bustling markets and crowded alleys, provided the perfect stage for the catastrophe. Contemporary chroniclers left accounts that chill the modern reader. Procopius, a historian of Justinian's court, described bodies piled in the streets, so numerous that the living could not bury the dead. He spoke of a city where fear strangled commerce, where entire households vanished overnight. Victims suffered swollen lymph nodes, the infamous buboes, from which the disease takes its name. High fevers, delirium, and swift death followed. Some collapsed in the markets, others in churches, others on the road. There were not enough coffins, not enough gravediggers, not enough prayers to stem the tide. Constantinople, once the jewel of the empire, became a city of silence broken only by the sound of carts hauling corpses. Even Justinian himself was struck. In 542, the emperor fell ill with the plague, his body covered in the same swollen buboes that marked countless subjects. For days, the fate of the empire hung on his survival. Against the odds, he recovered, but his weakened state mirrored the empire's fragility. His vision of restoring Rome to its former glory would never fully recover. By some estimates, the plague killed up to half of Constantinople's population, and across the Mediterranean world, the death toll may have reached 25 million. In an age when populations were far smaller than today, this was a cataclysm of staggering proportions. The economic shock was immediate. Fields went untilled as peasants died or fled. Armies dwindled not from enemy swords but from disease. Tax revenues collapsed, leaving imperial coffers drained just when Justinian needed them to finance wars and construction projects. Grain shipments, once steady, became uncertain as ports and villages emptied. The empire had been a finely tuned machine, its strength drawn from the constant flow of goods and people across its vast territories. The plague jammed that machine, scattering its gears. Religious interpretations swirled as people tried to comprehend the incomprehensible. Many believed it was punishment from God, a divine rebuke for human pride. Priests led processions through the streets, chanting prayers and burning incense, though these gatherings often accelerated the spread. Others whispered darker theories, accusing foreigners, heretics, or even the emperor himself of angering the heavens. In times of terror, suspicion became a companion as common as grief. The psychological scars were deep. Imagine being a citizen of Constantinople in those years, seeing neighbors carried away daily, smelling the stench of rot in the summer air, hearing only silence where once there had been laughter and music. Survivors spoke of a city hollowed out, where shops remained shuttered for months, where children wandered without parents, where whole districts seemed abandoned. The grandeur of the empire seemed an illusion, stripped bare by the smallest of enemies. But the plague's impact extended beyond immediate horror. Historians argue that Justinian's efforts to reconquer the western provinces faltered not just because of military resistance but because his empire lacked the manpower and stability to sustain campaigns. Italy, ravaged by both war and disease, became a wasteland. In North Africa, newly regained territories slipped from control. The dream of a restored Roman Mediterranean crumbled, replaced by a shrunken, exhausted empire. Without the plague, might Justinian's vision have succeeded? Might Europe's political map have looked very different? The question remains tantalizing but unanswerable. Archaeological evidence complements the written accounts. In ancient burial grounds, researchers have discovered sudden spikes in mass graves dating to the 6th century. Modern science has even extracted traces of Yersinia pestis DNA from skeletons of this period, confirming that the pathogen responsible was indeed the same one that would later cause the infamous Black Death of the 14th century. This continuity makes the plague of Justinian not just a tragic episode but the opening chapter in a long saga of bubonic plague outbreaks that would torment humanity for nearly a millennium. And yet, in spite of the devastation, life went on. The empire did not collapse overnight. Walls were rebuilt, trade routes reopened, and survivors rebuilt families. But the memory lingered like a scar, a reminder that even the mightiest civilization could be humbled in days. For many, the plague was the first true apocalypse, a vision of what it meant for the world to unravel. Sermons and chronicles from the era describe a people convinced they were living in the end times, that the empire's greatness had provoked divine wrath. Even when the waves of disease subsided, the sense of fragility never fully faded. Today, the plague of Justinian remains one of history's lesser-remembered catastrophes, overshadowed by the Black Death that came centuries later. Yet in its own time, it reshaped the trajectory of empires. It stifled Rome's last great revival, it spread terror across continents, and it introduced the world to the recurring nightmare of bubonic plague. What began with rats on ships and fleas in grain sacks became a tidal wave that altered the course of civilizations. The empire survived, but its strength was broken. The dream of restoring Rome was left buried in the countless graves that dotted the Mediterranean, graves dug hurriedly for victims of a foe no one could see, but everyone feared. In the middle of the 14th century, a darkness swept across Europe that has never been forgotten, though even now its full horror is difficult to comprehend. It began, as plagues so often did, with whispers from distant lands. Rumors spread of whole villages in Asia where no one was left alive, of caravans found abandoned in the steppes, of ships drifting into harbors with every sailor dead. In 1347, the nightmare arrived in Europe, carried in the holds of trading vessels sailing from the Black Sea. They brought not only grain, spices, and cloth, but also rats, and on those rats the fleas that carried Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for one of the deadliest catastrophes in human history. The Black Death would kill an estimated one-third of Europe's population in just a few short years, leaving a scar that shaped society, religion, and culture for centuries. Imagine the scene as it unfolded in city after city. Ships docked in Sicily, in Genoa, in Venice, their crews already writhing with fever, covered in the swollen black buboes that gave the plague its name. Within days the disease spread inland, moving with merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims. No barrier seemed effective. Walled towns, monasteries, castles, all succumbed. In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio recorded in the Decameron how parents abandoned children, priests refused last rites, and neighbors sealed their doors against one another. The streets were filled with carts piled high with corpses, dumped into pits when cemeteries overflowed. Bells tolled endlessly until there were no longer enough bell ringers to continue. Silence replaced sound, broken only by the creak of wheels carrying the dead. The symptoms were grotesque. Victims developed painful swellings in the groin and armpits, fevers that drove them into delirium, and in many cases blackened skin from internal bleeding. Death often came within 3 to 5 days, sometimes faster. Entire families perished before neighbors even realized they were ill. In some cases, people who appeared healthy in the morning were dead by nightfall. The sheer speed of the plague gave it a supernatural aura, convincing many that it was not merely disease but divine punishment, the wrath of God unleashed upon a sinful world. Religious fervor exploded. Some communities organized processions of flagellants, men and women who whipped themselves in the streets, believing that self-inflicted suffering might appease divine anger. Others sought scapegoats. Across Europe, Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells or conspiring to spread the plague, leading to pogroms that killed thousands of innocent people. Fear drove cruelty, and the terror of the Black Death did not only destroy bodies but also shattered bonds of trust between neighbors, religions, and families. Yet the plague did not kill indiscriminately. It reshaped society in strange and lasting ways. With so many dead, labor became scarce. Serfs and peasants, once bound to the land with little bargaining power, suddenly found themselves in demand. Landlords, desperate to harvest crops and rebuild, had no choice but to offer better wages and freer conditions. In some regions, this shift eroded the foundations of feudalism. Villages emptied by death sometimes passed into the hands of survivors, giving commoners opportunities that would have been unthinkable in earlier times. The social order, once rigid, cracked under the strain. Art and culture reflected the trauma. Murals and carvings began to feature the danse macabre, the dance of death, in which skeletons led kings, bishops, and peasants alike in a grim procession. This imagery reminded survivors that death was the great equalizer, sparing no one. In manuscripts, scribes doodled skulls and coffins in the margins, grim humor in the face of despair. Even architecture bore the mark of the plague, as towns built plague chapels and monuments in memory of those lost. The Black Death did not merely kill, it etched itself into the imagination of Europe. Medicine, however, offered little comfort. Doctors in long, bird-like masks stuffed with herbs became enduring symbols of the time, though their treatments, bloodletting, fumigation, or drinking strange concoctions, were powerless against the disease. Theories abounded. Some believed the plague was spread by miasma, or bad air, rising from swamps and sewers. Others blamed planetary alignments, eclipses, or the sins of humankind. Practical measures like quarantining ships for 40 days, the origin of the word quarantine, emerged in Italian city-states, an early glimpse of the public health strategies that would one day become standard. Still, for most, survival was a matter of chance. The death toll is almost impossible to grasp. In just 4 years, between 1347 and 1351, tens of millions perished. Some regions lost over half their population. Entire monasteries were wiped out. Fields went fallow, towns shrank, and even great cities like Paris and London became shadows of themselves. Trade faltered, wars paused not by diplomacy but because armies themselves withered away from infection. The 100 Years' War between England and France slowed, not from peace treaties but from exhaustion. The plague did not discriminate between battlefield and village, between noble and beggar. And yet, out of devastation, new possibilities emerged. The labor shortages encouraged innovation. With fewer workers, landowners experimented with more efficient methods of farming, and craftspeople who survived could command higher prices. The plague accelerated social mobility, unsettling centuries-old hierarchies. Some historians even argue that the Renaissance, with its burst of creativity and human-centered thought, was partly born from the reshaping of society in the plague's wake. Death created space for transformation. The psychological aftermath lingered. Survivors were haunted by the memory of mass graves, by the emptiness of houses where entire families had vanished. Some turned to hedonism, reasoning that life was short and uncertain, and one should seize pleasures while possible. Others turned inward, embracing stricter forms of piety, hoping to avoid further divine wrath. Europe's spiritual landscape shifted, and seeds of doubt about the Church's power to protect against catastrophe began to grow. If prayer and ritual could not halt the plague, what other authority might guide humanity? Such questions would echo in later centuries, paving the way for reformations both religious and scientific. The Black Death was not a single event but a series of waves. After the initial outbreak, the plague returned again and again, flaring up every few decades. Generations grew up in its shadow, knowing that death could return at any time. This constant presence bred a culture of both fatalism and resilience. People adapted, learned to live with the possibility of sudden annihilation, and in doing so shaped a worldview that blended terror with pragmatism. Looking back, it is striking how the Black Death dwarfed the wars and politics of its age. Kings and generals fought for territory, yet microbes conquered them all. The plague reshaped Europe's demography, economy, culture, and even faith more profoundly than any battle. And still, despite its enormity, much of its detail is forgotten, overshadowed by later stories of progress and nation-building. When modern audiences picture medieval life, they might recall castles, knights, or cathedrals. Yet behind those images lies the silence of empty villages, the smell of unburied corpses, and the knowledge that a third of the continent was swept away in just a handful of years. The Black Death remains one of the clearest reminders of humanity's vulnerability. It was not stopped by walls, by armies, or by wealth. It was blind to status, merciless in its spread, and transformative in its consequences. To this day, the specter of the 14th century haunts us whenever a new epidemic arises. We may have vaccines, antibiotics, and modern hospitals, but the memory of that time whispers a warning: civilization, however mighty, is always fragile when faced with the smallest of enemies. The shadow of the Black Death lingered over Europe for centuries, but it was not the only plague to haunt the medieval and early modern world. Between the 14th and 17th centuries, waves of disease continued to wash over towns and kingdoms, sometimes less famous but no less terrifying for those who endured them. These outbreaks, though often overshadowed in history books, shaped daily life, left behind desperate chronicles, and changed the course of dynasties. They were the forgotten siblings of the Black Death, less remembered, yet equally capable of turning bustling cities into silent graveyards. One of the strangest and most unsettling was the mysterious, sweating sickness that erupted in England during the Tudor period. First appearing in 1485, the same year Henry Tudor claimed the crown at the Battle of Bosworth, it became an ominous backdrop to the birth of a new dynasty. Victims would feel an abrupt chill, then be overtaken by violent sweats, headaches, heart palpitations, and an overwhelming sense of impending doom. What made it uniquely terrifying was its speed. A man could be drinking in a tavern in the morning and dead before nightfall, carried off by exhaustion and fever. It struck hardest at the young and the strong, sparing the elderly and the very young, an inversion of most plagues that made it seem even more sinister. Entire households vanished within hours. Henry VII's court was shaken by the disease, and later, under his son Henry VIII, the sickness returned in waves, emptying colleges in Oxford and Cambridge, shuttering markets, and driving the wealthy to flee London whenever rumors of its presence surfaced. Physicians had no explanation. Some suspected it came from the miasmas of marshes, others whispered that it was a foreign import carried by soldiers. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the sweating sickness vanished from history in the mid-16th century, never to return. To this day, its cause remains debated. Some suggest a hantavirus, others an unknown influenza strain. For contemporaries, it was a phantom killer, unpredictable and unforgettable, its disappearance as unsettling as its arrival. While the sweating sickness struck England with eerie unpredictability, the Great Plague of London in 1665 was a far more familiar terror. By then, England had already experienced centuries of plague outbreaks, but this one would be the last great visitation of bubonic plague in the country. It began with scattered reports in the poorer districts, but soon the bells tolled ceaselessly. Samuel Pepys, the diarist whose words would preserve the memory of those days, wrote of red crosses painted on doors with the plea, "Lord have mercy upon us," marking houses where the infected were sealed inside. Carts trundled through the streets at night, men calling, "Bring out your dead," as families passed the bodies of their loved ones through windows to be taken to mass graves. The fear was palpable. Commerce ground to a halt, theaters closed, and the wealthy fled to country estates, leaving behind the poor to face the plague alone. Cats and dogs were slaughtered in the belief they spread the disease, though it was in truth the rats and fleas that did the work. Pepys describes the eerie silence of the city, the smell of lime pits where bodies were buried, and the surreal sight of deserted neighborhoods where grass began to grow between cobblestones. By the time the outbreak subsided, perhaps 100,000 Londoners, nearly a quarter of the city's population, were dead. Yet within a year, London would be struck again, not by disease but by the Great Fire of 1666, as though catastrophe had become its natural companion. Beyond England, other corners of Europe and its towns suffered plagues that rarely make the grand narratives but left deep scars. In small villages across Germany, Italy, and France, outbreaks would erupt, sometimes wiping out half the population of a single valley. Local records tell of processions halted because priests themselves had died, of marriages and baptisms delayed for years, of communities so reduced that fields lay abandoned. These were not the headline events of Europe, not the stories kings and chroniclers preserved, but for the people who lived through them, they were world-ending. What made these plagues particularly cruel was their unpredictability. A traveler might bring infection into a town that had been spared for decades, and within weeks, the familiar rhythm of life collapsed. Survivors often attributed these calamities to supernatural causes, and legends of local saints grew in their wake. Shrines were erected to figures believed to have offered protection, and pilgrimages to these sites increased, blending faith with desperation. Even today, scattered across Europe, one can find chapels dedicated to saints invoked against the plague, their origins rooted in these lesser-known outbreaks. These forgotten epidemics remind us that history is not only the grand catastrophes but also the countless smaller ones that never made it into sweeping narratives. For the people of Tudor England, the sweating sickness was every bit as frightening as the Black Death. For Londoners in 1665, the plague was not ancient history but a living nightmare. For peasants in alpine villages or fishing communities along the Baltic, a local outbreak meant the collapse of everything they knew, even if the wider world scarcely noticed. And yet, because these plagues did not always reshape entire continents, they have slipped into obscurity. They survive in parish records, in marginal notes of scribes, in diaries like that of Pepys, in folk memories and strange superstitions. They remind us that pandemics were not rare, isolated events but recurring intrusions into everyday life. Life in medieval and early modern Europe was lived under the constant shadow of disease. To be born in that world was to know that death might come suddenly, silently, and in ways that left no clear answers. The Black Death became legend, but these lesser-known plagues were the background hum of centuries, sometimes vanishing, sometimes returning, always reminding humanity of its frailty. They shaped how people prayed, how they built their cities, how they treated strangers, and how they imagined the line between life and death. Forgotten in history books, they lived vividly in the memory of those who endured them, whispering across generations until even those whispers faded. When Europeans set sail across the Atlantic, they carried more than steel, gunpowder, and the dream of empire. Hidden in their breath, their blood, and their cargo were pathogens that would do more to conquer the New World than any musket or sword. For indigenous civilizations, the arrival of these invisible invaders was nothing short of apocalyptic. Entire nations collapsed not in battle but in silence, as fevers raged, pustules erupted, and communities found themselves vanishing without explanation. It was the greatest biological catastrophe in recorded history, a wave of epidemics so devastating that they reshaped the very demographics of the Americas. The numbers are staggering. Historians estimate that in some regions, up to 90% of indigenous populations perished in the first century after European contact. From the Caribbean islands to the Andean highlands, once thriving societies dwindled into shadows of themselves. The Aztec and Inca empires, with their monumental cities and intricate systems of governance, were undone not only by conquistadors but by smallpox, measles, typhus, and other diseases that swept ahead of or alongside them. The first great outbreak struck the Caribbean soon after Columbus's voyages. Within decades, the islands that had seemed so densely populated were nearly empty. Chroniclers describe villages where no one remained alive to bury the dead, where parrots and monkeys outnumbered people, where fields reverted to jungle. Spanish colonists, dependent on indigenous labor, began importing enslaved Africans to replace the vanished workforce, a grim decision that linked epidemic devastation to the rise of the transatlantic slave trade. The most infamous outbreak occurred during the conquest of Mexico. In 1520, as Hernán Cortés laid siege to Tenochtitlan, a smallpox epidemic broke out among the Aztecs. Spanish accounts boast that the disease weakened their enemies, but indigenous chroniclers tell the story differently. They describe pustules covering bodies, like seeds of maize, eyes sealed shut with swelling, and entire households collapsing into silence. The epidemic killed Cuitlahuac, the Aztec emperor who had briefly rallied resistance, leaving the people leaderless. The city fell, not only because of Spanish weapons but because of smallpox. In the aftermath, the survivors buried so many dead that mass graves dotted the streets of one of the greatest cities of the Americas. But smallpox was only the beginning. Over the next century, waves of diseases struck again and again. Measles swept through populations weakened by hunger and grief. Typhus followed trade routes, striking coastal settlements and inland towns alike. Perhaps the most devastating of all was a mysterious epidemic in 16th-century Mexico known as cocolitli. Contemporary descriptions speak of high fevers, bleeding from the nose and ears, yellowing skin, and death within days. Some historians suggest it may have been a form of viral hemorrhagic fever, others a combination of diseases compounded by severe drought and famine. Whatever its nature, it killed millions, reducing the population of Mexico from roughly 20 million before contact to just a few million by the end of the century. The magnitude of this collapse defies comprehension. For the indigenous people who lived through these horrors, the experience must have seemed like the end of the world. Their gods and rituals had protected them for centuries, but now nothing seemed to work. Priests sacrificed, shamans prayed, communities begged the old spirits for help, yet the sicknesses only multiplied. Some saw the disasters as proof that the newcomers' gods were stronger, fueling conversions to Christianity. Others believed their world had entered a cycle of destruction, the fulfillment of prophecies warning of cosmic upheaval. European observers, meanwhile, often interpreted the epidemics as divine favor. To them, the plagues were a sign that God intended them to rule the New World. This belief became part of the ideology of conquest. The diseases were not accidental but providential, proof that indigenous civilizations were doomed and Europeans destined to replace them. Such thinking justified brutal policies, from forced conversions to enslavement, embedding epidemic devastation into the very logic of colonization. The social consequences were immense. Communities shattered by death struggled to maintain traditions. Elders, who carried oral histories and sacred knowledge, were lost in vast numbers, leaving cultural gaps that could never be filled. Languages vanished as populations dwindled. Entire villages merged or disappeared, reshaping maps as drastically as wars or treaties. Survivors often fled into remote regions to escape further contact, scattering peoples who had once lived in concentrated centers. The demographic collapse was so thorough that it created a kind of historical amnesia. By the time European colonists in later centuries described the Americas as empty or underpopulated, they were looking at landscapes already hollowed by epidemic waves. The Andes tell a similar story. When Francisco Pizarro and his men entered Inca territory, they found an empire already reeling from smallpox. The disease had preceded them, traveling faster than armies through trade routes and kinship networks. It killed Huayna Capac, the Inca ruler, and his heir, plunging the empire into a civil war between rival claimants. By the time Pizarro arrived, the political structure was fractured, the population weakened, and resistance undermined. Again, microbes achieved what armies could not. Archaeological and ecological evidence speaks as loudly as written accounts. Pollen records show sudden reforestation in areas once cultivated by large indigenous populations, evidence of abandoned farms and fields. Carbon levels in ice cores suggest that the massive die-off in the Americas may even have had global effects, with forests reclaiming farmland and reducing atmospheric carbon dioxide, a possible cooling influence during the so-called Little Ice Age. The collapse of millions of lives was so vast that it altered the climate itself. For Europeans, the epidemics opened vast new territories to exploitation. Colonists moved into lands once densely settled, claiming them as vacant. They interpreted depopulation as an invitation rather than a tragedy, weaving it into the mythology of discovery and expansion. Yet beneath the surface of this narrative lay silence, entire nations, songs, and traditions erased by disease, remembered only in fragments. In some places, indigenous communities found ways to adapt and endure. They developed new healing practices, blended old rituals with Christian prayers, and in time, survivors forged hybrid cultures that carried forward fragments of what had been lost. But the demographic collapse meant that even these adaptations were shaped by absence. Every ceremony, every story, carried the weight of those who were gone. The epidemics of the New World are often called the Great Dying, a phrase that conveys both scale and silence. It was not one plague but many, a cascade of diseases unleashed by contact, spreading faster than any conquest, dismantling civilizations that had thrived for centuries. For the Aztecs, the Incas, the Taino, and countless others, the apocalypse did not come with fire from the sky but with fevers, pustules, and bleeding that seemed to strike without reason. The world they knew ended not in battle, but in epidemic. This forgotten chapter of plague history matters because it reminds us how powerfully disease shapes human destiny. The conquests of the Americas were not simply victories of arms but of microbes. The legacies of these epidemics remain visible today, in the reduced populations of indigenous peoples, in the loss of countless traditions, and in the colonial structures built on the ruins of depopulated lands. It was one of the greatest demographic collapses in human history, yet too often it is remembered as background rather than as the central force it was. To understand the making of the modern world, we must remember the plagues that erased so much of the old. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe and much of the world believed they were entering a new age of progress. Enlightenment ideals, industrial revolutions, and scientific discoveries promised that the darkness of the medieval past had been left behind. But disease did not vanish with new philosophies or with the smoke rising from factory chimneys. Instead, it adapted, found new footholds in growing cities, and struck with renewed force in the age of empire. The forgotten plagues of this era remind us that beneath the optimism of progress, the world was still fragile, its streets and ships still haunted by invisible killers. One of the most dreaded of these was cholera. Before the 1800s, the disease was largely confined to the Ganges Delta in India, where it erupted sporadically and burned itself out in local communities. But with the expansion of European trade and colonization, cholera escaped its home and entered the global bloodstream. Soldiers, sailors, and merchants carried it across oceans and continents. Its symptoms were brutal: relentless vomiting and diarrhea that left victims dehydrated, their skin turning blue from lack of oxygen, their bodies shriveled as though life itself had been drained away. Death could arrive in a matter of hours. In the early 19th century, cholera pandemics swept the world in waves. The first major pandemic began in 1817, spreading from India to Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and eventually reaching Europe by the 1830s. Cities like Paris and London, already teeming with impoverished workers crowded into filthy tenements, became breeding grounds. The disease revealed the fault lines of industrial society. The wealthy could flee to country estates, but the poor remained in neighborhoods where water was drawn from the same rivers that carried sewage. Fear turned to anger. In many cities, riots erupted against medical authorities accused of poisoning wells or using the poor as subjects for experiments. Cholera was not only a biological terror but a social one, exposing inequality in ways that could not be ignored. The pandemics forced slow but revolutionary change. In London, the physician John Snow mapped cases of cholera during an outbreak in 1854, tracing them to a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street. His work provided some of the earliest evidence that disease could spread through contaminated water, not just through bad air or miasma. Though mocked at first, Snow's insights became foundational for modern epidemiology. Cholera, in its devastation, helped give birth to the very science that would eventually contain it. But cholera was only part of the story. In Russia and Eastern Europe, typhus reappeared in waves, often accompanying war and famine. Spread by lice, typhus thrived in the cramped conditions of armies, prisons, and refugee camps. During Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812, typhus killed more soldiers than battle ever could. The Grande Armée that marched in with 500,000 men staggered back with only a fraction, their ranks thinned not just by the Russian winter but by fever, rash, and delirium. Disease was the silent ally of Russia, ensuring Napoleon's downfall. Elsewhere, yellow fever haunted port cities across the Atlantic world. Originating in Africa and carried by mosquitoes, it struck Havana, New Orleans, and Philadelphia with terrifying regularity. In the summer of 1793, Philadelphia, then the capital of the young United States, was gripped by a yellow fever epidemic that killed nearly 10% of the city's population. Streets were abandoned, officials fled, and wagons piled with corpses rolled through neighborhoods. Survivors spoke of the stench of decay, the yellowing eyes and skin of the afflicted, and the eerie quiet of a city reduced to fear. Each summer, as mosquitoes bred in stagnant water, the possibility of a new outbreak hung over entire communities. For sailors and merchants, yellow fever became as feared as shipwrecks or piracy. Even the supposedly secure world of Europe was not immune to reawakening terrors. The plague, though diminished since the 17th century, still flickered in outbreaks along the Mediterranean and the Middle East. In 1720, the city of Marseille was struck by a plague that killed nearly half its population in just 2 years. Despite attempts at quarantine, rats and fleas carried the infection through markets and ships. The city built new cemeteries to cope with the dead, and officials erected walls to seal off infected neighborhoods. The trauma was so great that the memory of the plague lingered for generations, shaping the way Marseille rebuilt itself. The 19th century also saw the global spread of tuberculosis, known as consumption. Unlike the swift and brutal killers such as cholera, consumption worked slowly, eating away at the lungs over months or years. It was a disease of the industrial age, thriving in crowded factories, boarding houses, and urban slums. Coughs filled with blood, wasting away of the body, fevered nights of sweating, it was both common and terrifying. Yet consumption became strangely romanticized in art and literature, associated with fragile beauty and tragic genius. Poets, musicians, and painters who succumbed to it, Keats, Chopin, Munch's family, fed the cultural myth of the consumptive artist. Behind the myth, however, was a very real and devastating epidemic that killed millions. These 18th and 19th century plagues remind us that progress did not shield humanity from suffering. In fact, industrialization and empire often spread disease faster, carrying pathogens along new trade routes and into crowded cities. Epidemics flourished where inequality thrived, among the poor, the displaced, and the colonized. They revealed the limits of medical knowledge but also pushed it forward, forcing societies to confront sanitation, public health, and the role of government in protecting lives. When we think of the age of revolutions, we picture declarations of independence, guillotines, steam engines, and railroads. But beneath these great events, disease was constantly reshaping the landscape. Epidemics killed soldiers before they reached battlefields, wiped out communities before they could industrialize, and haunted the growth of empires. The forgotten plagues of this period are reminders that history is never only about politics and inventions, it is also about microbes, silently steering the fate of nations. By the closing years of the 19th century, the world was more connected than ever before. Steamships crisscrossed oceans, railroads cut across continents, and telegraphs carried news faster than any messenger in history. But with this new network came new vulnerabilities. Pathogens that once burned out in isolated corners could now leapfrog across nations in weeks. It was in this globalized world that the third plague pandemic emerged, an outbreak that began in the hills of southern China and spread across the world, shaping colonial policies, urban planning, and even the course of scientific discovery. The story began in the 1850s in Yunnan province, where local unrest, displacement, and ecological disruption created fertile ground for plague to reappear. Rats carrying infected fleas thrived in disturbed environments, and outbreaks flared in villages and trade towns. For decades the disease simmered in the interior, largely unnoticed by the outside world. But in the late 1890s, the infection reached Hong Kong, one of the busiest ports in Asia. From there, it became unstoppable. Steamships carried rats and fleas in their cargo holds, scattering plague across the shipping lanes of the British Empire and beyond. Hong Kong itself became the stage of a crisis. In 1894, the city was gripped by panic as thousands died in the sweltering summer months. British colonial officials ordered mass cleanings, burning of infected houses, and forced evacuations of Chinese neighborhoods. The measures were often brutal and racially charged, reinforcing divides between colonial authorities and local populations. Bodies were carted out of homes under military guard, entire districts were fumigated, and families found themselves displaced in the name of quarantine. For many residents, the plague was not just a biological disaster but a social one, deepening resentment against imperial power. Yet Hong Kong also became the site of scientific breakthrough. Two rival scientists, Alexander Yersin, a Swiss-French bacteriologist, and Shibasaburo Kitasato, a Japanese physician trained in Germany, raced to identify the cause of the plague. Yersin ultimately isolated the bacterium that bears his name, Yersinia pestis, proving that the same microbe responsible for the Black Death centuries earlier was again at work. This discovery confirmed that plague was not a curse or a mystery but a bacterial infection carried by rats and fleas. For the first time, humanity could begin to understand the true nature of one of its oldest enemies. But understanding did not mean control. From Hong Kong, plague spread to Bombay, to Sydney, to Cape Town, to San Francisco. Each city experienced its own crisis. In Bombay, outbreaks in the 1890s killed tens of thousands, prompting colonial authorities to impose draconian health measures. Homes were searched, the sick removed by force, and traditional practices disrupted. The result was resistance, riots, attacks on officials, and widespread distrust of Western medicine. The plague revealed not just the fragility of bodies but also the fragility of empire, showing how quickly colonial legitimacy could be undermined when health policies clashed with local customs. In San Francisco, plague arrived in 1900, carried in the bodies of infected rats that disembarked from a ship in Chinatown. The outbreak became a political scandal. Local officials, fearing damage to the city's reputation and its lucrative trade, initially denied the disease's presence. Chinatown residents bore the brunt of quarantines and restrictions, targeted by health officers while the rest of the city continued life as usual. Newspapers fanned racial prejudices, portraying plague as a disease of immigrants. Only years later, when further outbreaks proved undeniable, did systematic rat control and sanitation campaigns begin to curb the spread. The third pandemic was not confined to cities. It traveled inland along railroads, reaching villages, mining camps, and plantations. India suffered some of the worst losses. Millions died in repeated outbreaks well into the 20th century. In many rural areas, plague was remembered not in official records but in oral traditions of abandoned villages and haunted fields. Families recounted tales of fleeing at night, leaving behind homes and possessions, or of entire lineages wiped out in a single season. Yet the pandemic also drove innovation. Governments began to take public health more seriously, investing in sanitation, rat-proofing buildings, and organizing international health conferences. Quarantine systems became more standardized, and port inspections more rigorous. Scientific research flourished, leading to the development of early plague vaccines, though their effectiveness was limited. For the first time, nations recognized that disease was not just a local problem but a global one, requiring cooperation across borders. Alongside plague, cholera continued its deadly march in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Successive pandemics spread from India outward, each wave reminding the world of its vulnerability. In Cairo, Constantinople, and St. Petersburg, cholera struck with terrifying suddenness. In New York and London, outbreaks exposed the weaknesses of rapidly growing cities. The disease became almost synonymous with modern urban misery: contaminated water, overcrowded housing, and the stench of untreated sewage. The persistence of cholera forced cities to transform. Sewer systems were expanded, water supplies filtered, and public health boards empowered to intervene in private life. These changes were not just technical, they were political, reshaping the relationship between governments and their citizens. People came to expect that authorities should protect them from disease, an expectation that would define the modern state. Together, plague and cholera made the 19th century a paradox. It was an age of science and progress, yet it was also an age of recurring epidemics that humbled even the most powerful nations. The world could now measure disease under a microscope, name its microbes, and even begin to imagine vaccines, but cities still burned with fever, families still buried their dead in haste, and panic still spread faster than reason. The third pandemic marked a turning point. It reminded the world that plague was not a medieval relic but a living threat, one that could exploit modern transport as easily as it once spread along caravans and ships. It forced governments and scientists to see disease as a global phenomenon, demanding international cooperation. And it left scars that endured long after the last outbreak faded, from the mistrust in colonial cities to the reinforced segregation of urban neighborhoods. For many, the memory of the third plague pandemic has faded, overshadowed by wars and revolutions. Yet in its time, it was one of the defining global crises. It revealed how fragile progress truly was, how easily the promise of the modern world could be undone by the same enemy that had haunted humanity for millennia. The rats scuttling in the shadows, the fleas carrying an ancient bacterium, were reminders that history's most persistent killers had not been left behind, they had simply been waiting for new opportunities. The 20th century is often remembered as the age of modern medicine. Antibiotics, vaccines, and advanced hospitals promised to tame the terrors that had haunted humanity for millennia. And indeed, progress was undeniable. Diseases that once cut down millions were brought under control, and lifespans rose dramatically. But the story of the 20th century is not one of triumph alone. It is also the story of epidemics that defied modern confidence, that spread across nations faster than science could contain, that reminded the world progress could never mean invulnerability. In this century of wars and revolutions, pandemics remain silent companions, shaping societies as powerfully as politics or technology. The most infamous of all was the influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919, known popularly as the Spanish flu. Emerging in the final year of the First World War, it swept across the globe with a speed and scale never before recorded. Within months, the virus infected an estimated one-third of the world's population. Between 50 and 100 million people died, more than the Great War itself had claimed in 4 years of carnage. What made the pandemic particularly haunting was its unusual pattern. Unlike most flus, which kill primarily the very young and the very old, the 1918 strain struck hardest at healthy young adults, the very people expected to survive. Hospitals overflowed with soldiers and workers in the prime of life, their lungs filling with fluid, their skin turning a ghastly blue from lack of oxygen. Entire barracks, entire families, were wiped out within days. Cities shut down in eerie silence. In Philadelphia, parades and public gatherings turned into superspreader events, leaving thousands dead within weeks. Coffins ran out, and bodies piled in morgues. Schools and theaters closed, funerals were forbidden, and many communities enforced makeshift quarantines. Photographs from the time show streets filled with masked citizens, faces hidden in gauze as though humanity itself had turned faceless. Governments, fearful of undermining morale during wartime, often censored reports, creating confusion and suspicion. Newspapers in Spain, neutral in the war, reported freely, giving the disease its misleading nickname, Spanish flu. The truth was that it was everywhere, from Kansas farms to Indian villages, from African colonies to remote islands in the Pacific. No corner of the world was spared. The influenza pandemic left deep scars, but in its aftermath, it faded strangely from memory. Overshadowed by the war, it was rarely commemorated in monuments or history books. Survivors carried the memory quietly, but nations preferred to focus on victory, peace treaties, and rebuilding. Yet the silence could not erase the fact that a virus had humbled the modern world more thoroughly than the guns of Europe's great powers. Other epidemics haunted the century in different ways. Polio became one of the most feared diseases of the early and mid-20th century. Unlike influenza, which killed swiftly, polio struck silently and unpredictably, often in summer months. Children were its most common victims. Some developed only mild symptoms, but others suffered paralysis that could last a lifetime. Parents lived in fear that an ordinary fever or stiff neck might be the beginning of irreversible disability. Hospitals filled with the eerie sight of iron lungs, massive machines that mechanically breathed for those whose muscles had been paralyzed. Rows of children lay encased in metal cylinders, their heads protruding, their lives dependent on pumps and pistons. Communities responded with a mixture of terror and determination. Public swimming pools were drained, playgrounds abandoned, gatherings discouraged. Yet out of fear came remarkable triumph. In the 1950s, Jonas Salk developed the first effective polio vaccine, followed later by Albert Sabin's oral vaccine. Mass immunization campaigns turned polio from a nightmare into a disease on the brink of eradication. For mid-century humanity, this was proof that science could conquer even the most dreaded plagues, if given time and resources. Tuberculosis, long a silent killer, also lingered through the early 20th century. Despite advances in medicine, it continued to claim millions of lives, especially in crowded urban centers and among the poor. Sanatoriums became symbols of both hope and despair, isolated facilities where patients were sent for rest, fresh air, and a slim chance of survival. Writers and artists who spent years in these institutions left behind vivid testimonies of life lived under the shadow of slow death. Only with the discovery of antibiotics in the 1940s did the tide begin to turn. Meanwhile, colonial empires faced epidemics in their territories that often went underreported in Europe. Malaria, sleeping sickness, and yellow fever ravaged African and Asian colonies, shaping patterns of settlement, labor, and exploitation. Entire regions were declared white man's graveyards, unsuitable for European habitation because of endemic disease. Quinine, a treatment for malaria, became as strategic as rifles or railroads in maintaining imperial control. Epidemics in the colonies rarely made headlines in the metropole, yet they quietly determined the boundaries and limits of empire. The 20th century also introduced a new category of epidemic, those amplified by modern war and displacement. Typhus and dysentery ravaged refugee camps during both world wars. In concentration camps and prisoner-of-war facilities, diseases spread unchecked, killing thousands. In these environments, disease became both a byproduct of war and a weapon of it. The link between conflict and epidemic became undeniable. Wherever societies collapsed, microbes followed. The memory of these epidemics shaped global institutions. After the Second World War, the creation of the World Health Organization reflected a recognition that disease was a global threat requiring global cooperation. Campaigns against malaria, smallpox, and other diseases were launched on a scale never before attempted. In 1980, the WHO declared smallpox eradicated, the first and only human disease to be eliminated completely by human effort. It was a moment of triumph, proof that centuries of suffering could end with coordinated science and determination. Yet even then, other threats loomed, waiting to remind humanity that victory could never be permanent. The plagues of the 20th century, from Spanish flu to polio, from tuberculosis to colonial epidemics, reveal a complex picture. Science advanced, and victories were real. But fear never vanished. Epidemics continued to erupt, sometimes more devastating than before, sometimes haunting societies in quieter, slower ways. The century of progress was also the century of masks, iron lungs, and mass graves. To understand it fully, one must see not only the wars and technologies but also the microbes that moved through trenches, schools, hospitals, and households. They were as much a part of the 20th century story as tanks or airplanes. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, humanity carried with it both a legacy of triumph and a sense of vulnerability. The eradication of smallpox in 1980 had proven that disease could be defeated with global cooperation, vaccines, and determination. Optimists believed that other ancient killers would soon follow. Yet just as confidence reached its height, new plagues emerged, diseases modern science had never seen before, striking with force, reshaping societies, and reminding the world that microbes were endlessly inventive. The age of forgotten plagues had not ended, it had simply taken new forms. The most defining epidemic of the late 20th century was HIV/AIDS. First identified in the early 1980s, it began quietly, with clusters of unusual illnesses among young men in Los Angeles and New York. Soon, the pattern was clear: a virus was devastating the body's immune system, leaving patients vulnerable to infections that healthy bodies could easily resist. At first, the disease was misunderstood, even dismissed. Stigma surrounded it, fueled by fear, prejudice, and misinformation. Many governments were slow to act, and the public conversation was clouded by moral judgments. But the virus did not discriminate. It spread silently, through blood transfusions, sexual contact, and contaminated needles, across communities and continents. By the mid-1980s, it was clear the world was facing a global epidemic. Entire neighborhoods in American cities were transformed by loss. Hospitals overflowed, not with a sudden surge like influenza, but with a steady, relentless tide of young men, women, and children succumbing to opportunistic infections. Families mourned in silence, communities rallied, and activists demanded attention. The pink triangle and the red ribbon became symbols of resistance and remembrance. By the 1990s, HIV/AIDS had become one of the leading causes of death worldwide, devastating not only the West but above all sub-Saharan Africa, where millions were infected. In some countries, life expectancy collapsed by decades, economies faltered, and children grew up in villages where entire generations of adults had been lost. Science eventually caught up. The development of antiretroviral therapies in the mid-1990s transformed HIV from a death sentence into a chronic condition for those who could access treatment. Yet access was not equal. Wealthy nations saw survival rates climb, while poorer regions, particularly in Africa, struggled with limited supplies and unaffordable costs. The AIDS crisis revealed not only the power of a new virus but also the deep inequalities of a globalized world. It forced societies to confront questions of stigma, sexuality, and responsibility. It was a plague of its time, as much social as biological, reshaping politics, culture, and medicine. Alongside HIV, AIDS, other viral threats emerged with sudden violence. In 1976, a mysterious outbreak in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, introduced the world to Ebola. Named after a nearby river, the virus caused fever, vomiting, and terrifying hemorrhages. Mortality rates soared above 50%, sometimes higher. Villages emptied overnight as families fled, terrified of a disease that seemed to dissolve the body from within. For decades, Ebola flared sporadically in Central Africa, each time sparking international fear. Images of protective suits, isolation tents, and makeshift clinics became symbols of a new age of epidemic response. Though outbreaks were often contained, the fear of global spread lingered, a reminder of how easily local crises could leap borders in an interconnected world. SARS, or Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, appeared in 2002 to 2003, spreading from China to Hong Kong and then across the globe. Caused by a novel coronavirus, it infected over 8,000 people and killed nearly 800. Though the numbers were small compared to older plagues, the impact was enormous. For the first time in the 21st century, entire cities were placed under quarantine, international travel was disrupted, and economies trembled at the sight of massed crowds and empty airports. The rapid response and eventual containment of SARS were hailed as victories of modern public health. But they also served as warnings. New viruses were emerging from animal reservoirs, and humanity's global networks meant no region was safe from their reach. Avian influenza and swine flu followed, each sparking global anxiety. The H1N1 influenza pandemic of 2009 spread rapidly, though it proved less deadly than feared. Still, the sight of governments scrambling to produce vaccines, of schools closing and flights being cancelled, showed how deeply the memory of past plagues lingered. Each new outbreak revived echoes of Spanish flu, of cholera, of forgotten epidemics, reminding the world that progress was always provisional. Epidemics also became entangled with politics and culture. The response to HIV/AIDS was shaped by activism and stigma. The handling of SARS and avian flu highlighted issues of government transparency and international cooperation. Ebola outbreaks in the 2010s sparked debates about global solidarity, as Western countries rushed to protect their own borders while local African health workers faced the disease at its source. In each case, microbes tested not only immune systems but also the bonds of human society. By the dawn of the 21st century, it was clear that humanity had entered a new phase in its long struggle with disease. Old foes like plague, cholera, and tuberculosis had not entirely disappeared, but new ones, viruses with no history in human populations, were appearing with increasing frequency. Climate change, deforestation, and global travel all created conditions for diseases to leap from animals to humans, and from villages to megacities in days. The forgotten plagues of the past had never truly been forgotten, they lived in the collective memory, shaping the fear and urgency with which new epidemics were met. The late 20th and early 21st centuries thus occupy a strange place in the history of plagues. They are an era of unprecedented medical progress, when diseases that once devastated millions could be controlled with a pill or a vaccine. Yet they are also an era of uncertainty, when new pathogens remind us that nature is always ahead of us, that evolution does not stop, and that history never ends. In these years, epidemics became both medical events and cultural flashpoints, shaping debates about inequality, trust, responsibility, and the very meaning of globalization. The story of HIV, AIDS, Ebola, SARS, and influenza is not separate from the story of plague, smallpox, and cholera. It is the same story told in a new chapter, humanity confronted by forces it cannot fully predict, struggling to adapt, sometimes failing, sometimes triumphing, always reminded of its fragility. To study these recent epidemics is to see the echo of every forgotten plague that came before. The names change, the technologies evolve, but the pattern is hauntingly familiar. History is often told through the rise and fall of empires, through battles and treaties, inventions and revolutions. But hidden beneath these familiar stories lies another force, quieter yet more relentless, the plagues that stalk humanity across the centuries. From the Black Death that hollowed medieval Europe, to the cholera outbreaks that reshaped modern cities, to the influenza that darkened the end of the First World War, and to the viral threats of our own age, disease has been as decisive in shaping the human story as generals or kings. The forgotten plagues are not side notes, they are central chapters. What makes their history so striking is not just their devastation, but the ways they reveal who we are when confronted by fear. Epidemics hold up a mirror to societies. They expose the inequalities that make some suffer more than others. They test governments, showing whether leaders act with transparency and courage or with denial and repression. They shape culture, inspiring stories of saints, scapegoats, and survival. And they leave legacies that linger long after the microbes themselves retreat, new institutions, new sciences, new ways of living with one another. The forgotten plagues also remind us of how fragile progress can be. At times, humanity has believed itself victorious. The development of antibiotics, the eradication of smallpox, the creation of vaccines, each has been hailed as the dawn of a new age. Yet again and again, disease has returned in unfamiliar forms, forcing us to learn humility. The confidence of the 20th century gave way to the shock of HIV, AIDS, to the alarms of Ebola and SARS, to the anxieties of influenza pandemics. These were not just medical crises but historical reminders, echoes of every forgotten plague that came before. And yet, there is another side to this story. Plagues have brought suffering, but they have also brought resilience. Communities have found ways to support one another in the darkest hours. Families nursed the sick when hospitals were overwhelmed. Entire generations of doctors, nurses, and scientists devoted their lives to understanding and fighting invisible enemies. The history of plagues is not only about despair, it is about determination, solidarity, and adaptation. Humanity has been broken many times, but never defeated. When we look back, it is striking how much of our modern world was shaped by past epidemics. The water systems and sanitation networks that define our cities were born out of cholera. The international health organizations that monitor outbreaks today grew from efforts to contain plague and yellow fever. Our very ideas of public responsibility and state power were forged in moments when disease made private suffering a collective issue. Plagues may be forgotten in memory, but they live on in the architecture of our societies, in the institutions that govern us, in the very way we understand health and survival. There is, finally, a lesson of perspective. We often think of history as progress, a steady march toward improvement. But the history of plagues teaches us that progress is not a straight line. It is fragile, uneven, always vulnerable to reversal. Microbes do not care for borders, ideologies, or ambitions. They move silently, exploiting the cracks in our defenses, the moments of our overconfidence. To forget them is to invite their return. And so, the story of the forgotten plagues is not merely a story of the past. It is a warning, a reminder, and perhaps even a guide. If we remember how fear and stigma slowed the fight against HIV, perhaps we will act differently when the next unknown virus appears. If we remember how cholera forced cities to invest in clean water, we might be quicker to protect vulnerable communities today. If we remember how the Black Death reshaped economies and societies, we might see how even crises can spark renewal. The past whispers to us, not just through monuments and texts, but through the long shadows of disease. To listen to those whispers is to see our own world differently. We are not the first to face invisible enemies. We will not be the last. But perhaps, with memory, with humility, with cooperation, we can face them better. The forgotten plagues are not truly forgotten. They live in our blood, in our cities, in our politics, in our fears. To tell their story is to tell our own, a story of vulnerability and survival, of loss and renewal, of how the smallest of creatures have shaped the largest of histories.